All right, everyone, welcome to episode 111 of Midwestern Geek in Cali. Today's episode is the first one basically since the lockdown. I have been dealing with a lot of fun. My internet in out here in 42 TARDIS Way has been really chopped. And turns out Windows 10, one of the updates, killed my Realtek Wi-Fi adapter. Yeah, it ate the driver enough. Well, let's just say that the driver for the Wi-Fi adapter has been broken since that Windows update. And on top of that, yeah, at work, we went online within 2 weeks, which has been a massive undertaking. And I did not have time to play much with my workstation out here. So finally, the other day, I just went and got a new USB Wi-Fi dongle, a TP-Link. It's pretty nice and it seems to be working fine. The internet's been stable since. So I'm now able to work and do uploads from out here. I also had numerous updates pending because this machine hasn't really been able to be reliably online for more than 5 minutes in a couple of months. So obviously, as you can see with the Corona Rona, my hair is getting a little bit on the long side. Nothing new to me. I'm used to it. I mean, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, so yeah, I don't mind. Actually, it's kind of fun to grow it back out a little bit for a while. So we'll see how that goes. I consider myself kind of lucky that at this age to be able to grow it back out. Just saying. Uh, Anyway, so tonight's episode, this is episode 111, and I'm going to be walking everyone through some basic computer hardware. So, I do this lecture when I teach, every so often, and I'm gonna break it down a little bit. I'm doing this over the next couple of weeks for Civil Air Patrol for the cadets in our squadron, and it's going to be a basic understanding, like a computer in a nutshell kind of thing. So we're going to get to what the hardware does inside a computer. All right. So obviously, in order to do this, I'm going to have to show my screen. So here comes the ever famous Midwestern Geek and Cali infinity screen. Get ready. Here it comes. The infinity screen. All right. Now, obviously, to be able to see what I am giving you, I need the glasses on. So here comes the eyeball glare. Yeah, I know. I'm aware of it, but we shall conquer anyway. So here we go. We are looking at the motherboard inside a computer. So I want to get to some of the basic components in the computer, and we'll get on that in just a second here. I'm getting a little dry, so a little sip of rocket fuel. And I'm going to try to stay away from, let me see here. I'm going to flip back to the infinity screen. All right, so I need to stay away from that lower left corner of the screen because you guys can't see that behind the picture of me, which is fine. That's all right. All right, so we're going to go in and take a look, and we've got a really good overview here of the motherboard of a PC. This is a little bit older motherboard, and I like using this motherboard because it has a few things that are out on the motherboard that in slightly newer motherboards are tucked away inside the CPU chip, which you wouldn't be able to see them. It makes this a little bit easier for me to give you an explanation of what these components do, and we'll get to what those are in a few minutes. So the first thing we have here is the CPU, the central processing unit, and that actually is a chip that's buried underneath this stack here. The stack, on top of the stack, we have the CPU fan or central processing unit fan, And below the fan, we have the CPU heatsink, which is generally an aluminum block of metal with a bunch of fins, and the fan pulls air through that to cool it off. And then underneath the heatsink is the CPU chip. And between the two of them, there is a layer of what's called thermal paste, all right, that is between the CPU and the heatsink. And it is nothing to do with sticking together the CPU and the heatsink. Has nothing to do with that. It's called thermal paste for a reason. It's about transferring heat from the CPU to the heatsink. It's getting that heat out of the CPU and into the heatsink so the fan can radiate that heat away from the CPU chip so it doesn't overheat. So Gorilla Glue won't work here. There's a clue. Gorilla Glue will not do it. Okay, don't Gorilla Glue your heatsink to your CPU because you're going to be buying a new heatsink and a CPU if you do that. All right, thermal paste. And if you end up having to take the CPU and the heatsink apart, make sure you clean the old thermal paste off of both of them and put fresh. The stuff comes in a tube. It's not that expensive. It's way worth it. You need to put fresh on every time you take that apart for any reason. All right, so be aware of that. We're going to zoom in a little bit here and we're going to take a little walk around this motherboard. Okay, and let me see here. All right, a little closer look at the CPU. Now, if you look here, these wires here are coming off the CPU fan and they connect to the motherboard right here. And I want you to pay attention here to the count of wires. There's 4 wires here. 1, 2, 3, 4 for the CPU fan. All right. Now, we're going to go take another look over here, and I want to show you this part here. Let me see. It's kind of cut off, but these red, yellow, and black wires are coming from the case fan or chassis fan. All right. And if you look, there's only 3 wires on a case or a chassis fan. Now, this is pretty important. And you can see the motherboard here is labeled chassis fan. All right. So remember, 3 wires there, and then over here for the CPU fan, 4 wires. Why the extra wire? Well, it's the CPU is going to sit there and he's going to say, "Hey, CPU fan, I'm dying here. I'm overheating, man. Speed up. Give me some more juice." I mean, I need more air, quick, before I have heat stroke, right? Or it's going to be, "Hey, fan, I'm cold. Slow down. Ease up." Now, it's the speed control. The extra wires to control the speed of the CPU fan. All right, so just be aware of that. Now, we're going to back out a little bit, and I'm going to show you right here. This particular power connector is called the CPU power. All right, now these wires are coming out of the power supply. The power supply supplies all the power to the motherboard, but the CPU cannot get enough power just through the main ATX power. And that ATX, I'm going to explain what ATX is in a bit. All right, I will explain it to you. It's about the shape and size and layout of all the parts in the computer. ATX is called a form factor. And just to be aware that this power connector, this is the main power connector in every computer, and this is called main ATX power. Now, the older ones had 20 pins. The newer ones have 24 pins. There's 12 up here, 12 down here. Used to be 10 and 10. And some of the power supplies, the kind of middle of the road power supplies from a little while ago, not so new as now where they're all 24, they had what's called 20 plus 4 pins, and you could take the last 4 pins off. They kind of snapped on with the rest of the connector or snapped off of there, so you could use that power supply with either a 20 pin motherboard or a 24 pin motherboard. Nowadays, they're pretty much all 24 because really when we were using 20 pin motherboards, you had like at most 2 cores in the CPU. Now it's like basically like two central processing units in one. Now the 24 pin and higher, this is for, six and eight core chips. Now, more cores, they need more power. So they needed a few more wires on the main ATX power connector to be able to supply more power to the motherboard for those extra cores. And also, you notice that the CPU power here only has four wires in this one. The newer motherboards, a lot of them have eight wires. Again, more cores in the CPU, they need more power. All right, so just be aware of that. Now, I'll warn you here, if this guy's not plugged in, even if the main power is plugged in down here, if this guy is not plugged in properly, or for that matter, if the fan connector is not plugged in, this CPU won't start if this guy is in. It just won't run, won't do anything. And if this guy's not plugged in, it'll start up, heat up too much, and shut itself down so it doesn't die from overheating. All right. So be aware of it. That CPU has to have its own power and its own cooling, fan cooling plugged in, or it ain't going to run. So just be aware of that. Okay. Now we're going to get to another more basic part of the motherboard right here. These are called capacitors. See these little silver cans here that are all over the motherboard? These are called capacitors. All right. And what capacitors do is they store electricity, kind of like a little battery. Okay. There's a big difference between a capacitor and a battery. All right. A battery lets its power go a little bit over a long period of time. Think of a flashlight; it runs for several hours before it runs out of juice. It just uses a little electricity at a time, and the battery trickles a little bit of electricity over a long period of time until it runs out of juice. Well, a capacitor is not like that at all. It stores electricity when the power's off, but as soon as something shorts across those two leads, bam, it lets all the power go at once. I mean, just like boom, right now, all of it, whatever's in there. All right. So when you get to dealing with bigger, higher voltage capacitors, those things are dangerous because even if the power's off and the thing's unplugged, they can be storing high voltage at enough current to knock you on your can or worse. So just be aware. Now, these little capacitors on a motherboard are not souped up enough to do that. But inside the power supply, that's another story. There's a couple of capacitors in there that are bigger enough to really do some serious damage to a human and even possibly cause death. So stay the heck out of those power supplies if you're not trained to work in them. All right. Same thing with the old CRT monitors, the ones with the big back on them, cathode ray tubes. Those things needed very high voltages to work, like we're talking around 50,000 volts, like taser range, only a lot more amperage. And those capacitors in those old CRTs, if you touch the wrong spot, you are really asking for it. You're flirting with the Grim Reaper there. So stay out of those things if you are not trained to work on them. Now, granted, in this day and age, the old CRT monitors are a lot less common. They're more of a throwback to a bygone era. But if you see one and there's something wrong with it and you think you might be able to fix it and you're not trained to do it, don't get in there and play, right? Because it's dangerous, all right? Now, these little capacitors, that's another story. These don't have enough juice in there to really do any damage. So if you accidentally touch a spot on the back, it's not good for the motherboard, but it's probably not going to harm you. Now, there's another reason why I'm pointing out capacitors. These things, over time, they heat, they cool, they expand, they contract, and eventually, sometimes, occasionally, you'll see capacitors in there that are all bulged out around the sides from being overheated or leaking brown fluid. That's called electrolyte. That's part of what makes a capacitor work. If either is the case, You might as well throw the motherboard away. It is junk. All right, here's why. Let's drill into this capacitor a little bit so you can see it more up close and personal. All right, now we're looking at this one capacitor right here. All right, now if this capacitor, now this is smaller than, say, the tip of my pinky here, this guy. It's more about the size of a pencil eraser, roughly. All right, if it were leaking brown fluid or it were all bulged out around the sides, and you saw that in there and you're like, oh, I can get that, I can order that on one of the electronics websites and have the exact same capacitor shipped, and then I can unsolder it and solder a new one, the new one in, and I should be good to go. No, 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 no. All right. If you try to unsolder this, sure, you could order another capacitor with the same specifications, but as the minute you try to unsolder it, look at these little tiny things. I mean, literally, let me get this scaled back down, and yeah, that's pretty close to life size right there. That is pretty right on. Look how tiny those little things are, and they have just this little itty bitty dab of solder holding them to the motherboard. The minute you go trying to unsolder this right here, you're going to loosen up the solder joints on all kinds of stuff around there on these little tiny things. And this motherboard's never going to work right again. It isn't worth the time. Okay? I guarantee you, when this motherboard got put together, there was a robot that came in and put all the big pieces on and soldered those in place. And then another robot came along and put all the medium size pieces on and soldered those in place. And then another robot came along and put all the little tiny, tiny stuff in place and soldered it just right. And it goes through a whole process and quality control and everything like that. And all this soldering is done by robots probably rather than humans, because I don't know too many human beings that can make all these little itsy bitsy solder joints that you see all over this motherboard and not mess them all up. So forget it. If you have leaking or bulged out capacitors, pitch the motherboard and go get a new one. It's not worth trying it because it isn't going to work. Just saying. All right. So now we're going to move on. That is, some really basic stuff. Now, we're going to talk about these guys over here. Um, and I'm going to come back to this view a little bit later because there's other things on here that I want to explain a little bit. But we're going to get back to this a little bit later. I want to get into what these two things here do. So we're going to flip over to another picture. Let me get out of the whole zoom mode right now. This particular picture has got a really good overview, so there's a lot of value in going through this one, but I want you to see some of this other stuff. All right, so here's another view of the capacitors and the little tiny components that are right next to them. So as you can see, itty bitty tiny stuff, and this is larger than life. I've got this pretty blown up here, right? Or let me put it this way: I took the picture a lot closer, and the camera tends to magnify it when you. That's another trick, by the way. If you're trying to read little tiny stuff on a motherboard and you're not quite sure what it's saying or etc., use your phone cam because it's a really good magnifying tool. Just FYI. All right, and a little bit more. I took this one here because it shows these couple of things here. Right now, if I were to show you the back of this, you'd see a couple of USB ports over here, and I want you to see that this says that this is USBs number 5 and 6 on the motherboard. Also, this screw here is pretty important. You see the white circle around this screw. And underneath this screw, there's all these little metal flanges. Well, this screw goes into what's called a standoff. It's like a little brass post that goes underneath the motherboard, and it screws into the case of the computer. And the purpose of the standoff, there's really three reasons to have a standoff under there. One is it keeps the back of the motherboard up and away from the metal side of the case so that the back of the motherboard isn't shorting out against the metal. Two, it leaves a little bit of air gap for extra cooling around there. But three, it also can provide a ground to the motherboard through these metal flanges that are under here. So let's take a look. I noticed in this view here, there's one here that has the screw missing. You can kind of see what that screw hole looks like without the screw actually in there. Let me drag that over here, and you can see here, here's one with the screw in it. Here's one without, and you can see the metal flanges that are part of the motherboard, and you can even see the brass threads in the standoff under there, right? So that screw head may well be providing a ground to the motherboard through these metal flanges. So you want to make sure if you have a standoff hole there that you have a screw in it, because this is not good that this screw is missing. It's not a good thing for the motherboard, right? Just FYI. All right, and just another quick look there. That was the CPU power there. All right, so this little chip here, notice that it's in a socket. It's not directly soldered to the motherboard. It's in a socket. This is called the CMOS chip. And this little chip actually has what's called the BIOS. The more modern version is UEFI, but BIOS is the older version. In either case, they do the same thing. This is the little bit of software that comes as part of the motherboard that tells the motherboard how to boot itself up, find Windows, and get the computer running when you first start it up. That's what it's there for. And if you look here, you can see we have this what's called the CMOS battery and the CMOS chip. And the CMOS is what holds the BIOS. All right. The BIOS stands for, like, I believe, basic input output system. But the bottom line is this is the software that tells the computer how to boot itself up. All right. Now, in this chip, they have two kinds of memory in this chip. They have what's called volatile memory, which means if the power goes out, any information in that memory goes poof, it's gone, instantly wiped out. It has to have constant power for it to keep what's in its memory. There's also a section of this chip that has non-volatile memory, and that does not lose its memory when the power goes out. Remember, volatile, it gets its memory completely wiped as soon as the power is gone. Non-volatile, it doesn't. It keeps it. All right, with power off, it keeps whatever's in there. So what do they do in here? Well, in the volatile portion is where they put all the options that you can change when you boot into the BIOS, and you change the time and date clock, or you change how the hard drives function, which is called SATA operation. You turn security on or off. You set a BIOS password, or you set a password on the hard drive. Anything that you can change in there in those settings is an optional setting, and that's in the volatile portion of the BIOS memory chip, the CMOS chip, right? And then anything that's a factory default setting is set in the non-volatile portion. Well, you might be thinking, why do they use these two different kinds of memory? Why wouldn't they just use non-volatile for everything? Because it takes a lot more power and effort, and it's much slower to change the information in the non-volatile memory. It's a lot of work, and it's also kind of risky to be doing, because if you get interrupted in the middle of changing that non-volatile memory, it's useless. You'll never be able to update it again. You can throw the motherboard away. All right. So there's a thing called flashing the BIOS. That's updating the software in that non-volatile portion of the memory, the default stuff. And if that gets interrupted in the middle, that motherboard is a brick, right? Same thing happens with the router. If you're updating the firmware in your router, it's basically the same thing as updating the non-volatile portion of the BIOS here. If it gets interrupted in the middle, there is nothing there anymore to tell this thing how to handle software updates, replace the software, do anything. It's wiped. It's done. It's toast. You have a brick. All right. So be very careful that you are not doing like a BIOS flash when the power is expected to be a brownout or there's thunderstorms in the area. Better yet, have an uninterruptible power supply on that thing so that you don't get interrupted in the middle. All right. But here's the other part about the battery. This battery here, the CR2032, almost all computers use the same type of watch battery. It's about the size of a quarter. And it is used to keep the memory in that optional volatile portion of the CMOS chip, like the time and date clock, how the hard drive is supposed to operate, what security settings are, what the boot order is. Does it look for a floppy drive? Does it look for an optical drive like a CD or a DVD, or does it look for a hard drive first? What is it going to boot from? Is it going to boot from USB? Which exact hard drive is it going to boot from? All those optional settings. So this battery makes sure that that memory is not lost if the power cable to the computer gets unplugged, like that big black cord that goes into the back of the power supply coming out of the wall, right? So that's what this is for. So here's the thing. Let's say I walk in and my computer one day and my computer's off. The power's been out. I know there was a power outage. I got clocks blinking or stuff like that around the house. I know the power went out, and I go in and my computer's off, and I'm like, okay. And I go to start the computer up, and all of a sudden the time and date on Windows says, oh, it's like 2010 or 2012 or 2008 or something like that. As soon as I see that, I know that this battery is dead because this battery was supposed to keep the optional settings in the volatile memory of the CMOS chip. And what happens if this battery is dead and the power goes out? Poof! All the information in the optional settings in the BIOS go away because they're in the volatile portion of the memory. And guess what? The default, the non-volatile memory over there is going to have a time and date from when this thing left the factory. Whenever this chip was manufactured, whatever the time and date was put in that factory default, it's going to revert back to that because that's what doesn't lose its memory when there's no power at all. This battery's job is to keep the information in the optional settings. And if it goes dead and the power goes out both at the same time, then you lose all the optional settings, including time and date. All right. So if you see that means you need to replace this battery and then set your options back to what they're supposed to be in the BIOS. All right. So very important there. Another quick look at the CPU fan. Okay, and another look at one of the standoff screw holes here. You can see also under the CPU, this is a standoff under here. You can tell by the white circle around the screw head. All right, and let's see. We'll go over to the next one. Another look at the chassis fan connector. Just you can see the labeling on the motherboard here. And this is some expansion slots on the back of the computer. So at this point, this is probably where I'm going to have to cut this episode off, and we'll pick this back up in the next episode next week. So I'm going to be having to break this up over two weeks for Civil Air Patrol because I'm not going to have enough time to cover the entire lecture in one meeting. And this is a really good spot to leave off. So I'm going to leave off at the expansion slots and some of these connectors on the back. And we'll pick up next week with what those are And on that note, I'm going to flip back over, kick the specs off, and we'll go back over to the camera view. And that means I need to get back over to the OBS, Open Broadcast Studio, which is what I use to record these, and say good night because I need to get dinner before the restaurant closes. I'm going to get some Italian carry out tonight. Yes, I will be wearing the mask. I'm a kind of science geeky kind of guy now, and that's just what I do. So I don't want to dive into the whole Corona rabbit hole, everybody. That's just, what I do, me personally. So we'll leave it at that. And I'd like to thank everyone for watching. I will pick this up in the next episode, probably next weekend. We'll go back into more of the motherboard, and it'll be a little deeper dive, and you'll be able to understand quite a bit more about what actually goes on when the computer's working when it's all said and done. The next one is really, really going to be more of the nutshell, nuts and bolts of what happens and how a computer does what it does and stuff like that. So, again, this was episode 111. This is my first one back after the coronavirus lockdown out here in California. It's not really because of the coronavirus directly that I haven't done an episode in a couple of months. It's more to do with time availability, everything going on around me, and computer problems all combining to really hold me back. But Midwestern Geek in Cali is alive and well. And on that note, happy Vulcan fingers to you from the agent of 42. This is probably the new social distancing salute. And of course, that goofed the focus on the camera. Let's zoom in and out. It doesn't like it when you move things in close and then move things away far. So let me see if I can play with the focus a little bit and get it to behave a little better. And on that note, also another tradition here, may there never be a rogue wave in your coffee mug. And may there be some coffee for me left in the coffee mug. And on that note, I hope everyone out there is staying safe, doing well, and making it through this whole crazy, crazy 2020. My vote for the next round of 2020 is alien invasion. Okay, just saying. This year has been really off the wall crazy. So let's see if I can get that camera to focus again. It trying to kind of drives me a little crazy sometimes. It just loves to fuzz out, and I think it's the way OBS talks to the driver and the thing. But otherwise, um, all's good here. I'll have the whole second half of the basics of how a PC works coming up next week, and hope everyone's doing well. Um, as always, you can find us at www.midwesterngeekincali.com. That'll take you to our blog. We're on Twitter at Midwest Geek Cali, and also on Facebook. We have a Facebook discussion group. There is a Discord server, but I'm going to completely revamp that thing and get it. I'm also kind of chewing on restarting the audio podcast to go with this, but that's another subject for down the road. I've found some new toys thanks to a friend of mine um, that would allow me to take callers, but I don't think I could get video callers. I could only get audio callers, so I'm chewing on whether or not to bring the audio podcast portion of this back and get that up and running again as well in conjunction with the YouTube or what. So, um, when I get that all finalized, I will be talking about it more, but I'm chewing on it in the background. Just FYI, I'm a small channel, so playing around with the format and stuff probably isn't a bad idea. And I would dearly love to have a co-host because I do not like monologue. Um, but for something like this, it works. So take care, everyone. Until next week, Thank you for watching, and I'm gonna call it a show.